Hello and welcome to this video, which will be dedicated to the long-range war between Russia and Ukraine, with a particular focus on the evolution of the effectiveness of Russian air defense, with an exponential increase in the number of long-range missiles and drones being launched by both sides. And this is forcing Russia in particular to rethink its doctrine and to launch an industrial race to keep intercepting as many missiles as possible, while Ukraine relied mostly on Soviet systems and then on those transferred by its allies. And now it has developed an increasingly effective interception system, but above all, one that is low cost. This is not the case for other countries. So first of all, we have to remember that at the beginning of the war, Ukraine's successes were completely unexpected, because Russian air defense then had the reputation of being the best in the world. That means that, on paper, the Russian specifications are simply superior to their Western equivalents, especially since they had 3 new systems that had entered service in the past 20 years, like the S-400 with its range of over 400 kilometers compared to only 150 to 180 kilometers for Western systems such as the Patriot or the Franco-Italian SAMP-T. In addition, it had a radar detection capability that was theoretically announced to reach up to 600 kilometers for large targets. So, again, that's far above what we needed for our systems, which intercepted at shorter ranges. Then there was the Pantsir, which has a range of up to 40 kilometers, and also the Tor M2 up to 15 kilometers. So Russia really seemed to have a modern multi-layered offering with an operational performance that seemed to be at a very high level. By the way, countries like Turkey had been tempted. Looking at it on paper, theoretically, it's true that it was great. So when the war started in February 2022, it was really a surprise when Ukraine managed to score hits with old Soviet equipment, like the Tochka-U ballistic missiles, where they managed to hit the Milarovo air base on the very second day of the war. Normally a base that's defended by S-400 systems, and they destroyed at least one Sukhoi 30, and probably other aircraft as well. On March 24th, the same missile managed to destroy an Alligator-class landing ship in the port of Berdyansk, which is on the shore of the Sea of Azov. Then we have the Smerch rocket launchers, the BM-30s, which fire 300 MME rockets. And here, too, the Russians keep claiming that they're able to intercept these rockets. But in reality, for example, there were 20 successful attacks counted on the Shornobaivka airbase alone, which is near Kherson. And it even became a real meme on the internet, because every time the Russians lost helicopters at that airport, they would bring in new helicopters the next day and have them destroyed in the same way. So much so that we reached 14 confirmed helicopters destroyed, proven by open-source images, which showed that the Russians were not able to intercept, once again, old Soviet missiles. But in the end, even at the end of the year, there was an even bigger surprise, since the Ukrainians put an old Tupolev 141 jet drone back into service, which would travel, hold on, more than 700 kilometers over Russian territory to be able to strike air bases, or at least 2. A strategic bomber was damaged, as well as other equipment that was hit. And besides these ballistic or cruise missiles, Russia hasn't been able to stop Ukrainian planes from continuing to fly. They haven't managed to destroy them on the ground, but these planes dare to carry out increasingly dangerous missions. They've already continued to operate on the front line. But we also have this incredible scene with an air raid carried out by helicopters. On April 1st, 2022, they actually crossed the border to strike Russian oil depots in the Belgorod area. Not to mention the direct bombings of Russian columns, which were no longer protected, simply with Mi-24 helicopters, or even those Sukhoi 24s that would fly overhead. Russian forces and Russian columns that no longer have the means to defend themselves, especially that huge traffic jam that had built up north of Kyiv at the beginning of the war. And then, of course, the Bayraktar TB2, which we've heard a lot about, caused a lot of damage. It had a real psychological impact at the beginning of the war and in the end seemed almost unstoppable. But eventually, after a few months, the Russians reorganized, because this observed inefficiency of the air defense is mainly due to equipment that was not up to the expected standard, especially when it comes to protecting Russian territory, where air bases protected by the most modern systems failed to stop simple missiles or Soviet-era systems. But we can also see that there was simply poor coordination among the teams, with orders that were simply inconsistent. For example, the Russians assumed that their first strike would have destroyed the entire Ukrainian Air Force, that there wouldn't be a single runway left for a plane to take off, and not a single operational aircraft. They believed anything flying was friendly, so they wouldn't shoot at their own aircraft and assumed they shouldn't shoot down anything in the air. And so, logically, they let planes and helicopters go by, simply because they thought they were much better than they actually were, especially the effectiveness and accuracy of their long-range cruise missiles. And so, with this realization, the Russians adapted, they organized their air defense better, they learned from their mistakes, and they also improved the detection capabilities of their radars through machine learning. For example, the Bayraktar, where the Ukrainians kept sharing images of destruction. The Russians looked at their radar images and they saw, hey, at that moment we didn't see the Bayraktar at the time, but eventually they learned by reanalyzing the images and by matching the radar information with the images that had been shared by the Ukrainians, who knew the position of the Bayraktar, and that's how they eventually learned where it was, and so they were able to put it in danger, whereas in the past, the Bayraktar, it used to freely raid cities as far as 130 kilometers past the Russian border, such as Bryansk. And that, obviously. Afterward, this wasn't possible because too many radars in the same area had learned to operate, and so the Bayraktars had to be limited to the Black Sea, where there was one radar per ship, which in principle does not allow them to be detected properly. But as for the planes, the Russians will also manage to shoot down a Ukrainian plane from more than 150 kilometers away. So from that moment on, all Ukrainian aircraft will have to fly at very low altitude, that is below 250 feet, simply to avoid being detected by Russian radars. And so the effectiveness of the Ukrainian Air Force is greatly reduced. Starting from April-May 2022, and from that moment on, there are only two other options left for the Ukrainians. Either they use their air force from a distance with standoff missiles so they don't have to get close to the bubble, protection, radar detection, and therefore interception by enemy air defense missiles. So that means missiles fired from very far away, and at that time they didn't have any. Or else it's about being able to destroy that air defense with dead missions. There's SAD, which is suppression of enemy air defense, and that's done with electronic warfare. We'll jam the radars or destroy them by launching missiles that home in on radar emissions. Afterwards, Ukrainians will get help from their allies, especially with the HIMARS missiles, which have a range of 80 kilometers and will arrive starting in June 2022. And even if the Russians then claim that all these missiles will be intercepted, that's not the case. In fact, we can even consider this as the first truly strategic weapon with a strategic effect in this war, because in the end, the HIMARS will be able to destroy all the bridges that supply the Russians who are on the right bank of the Dnipro in Kherson, that is, in the city of Kherson. And they no longer have supplies, they no longer have the ability to continue getting enough fuel and ammunition. And that's what will force the Russians to withdraw from this area in the fall of 2022. The liberation of 20,000 square kilometers during major counteroffensives was thanks to the HIMARS. Later, a second big announcement came in August with the first use of an American-made anti-radar missile called the AGM-88, which is integrated on the MiG-29 in record time because normally it takes months and months, even years, to test and integrate a missile on an old aircraft. And basically, the missile will detect a radar emission source, and it will track back to the source of the radar emission in order to destroy it. Once the radar is destroyed, the sky reopens for fighter jets to carry out missions, either for direct bombing or to get closer to the front line to drop their bombs, which will go a little further since from March 2023, the Ukrainians received the American glide bombs, called JDAM Extended Range, which have a theoretical range of 70 kilometers. If they are dropped from very high altitude, but since it's dangerous to go to very high altitude, they drop them while staying relatively low instead. So the range is 25 kilometers, but it still allows them to deliver bombs weighing several hundred kilos onto a hardened target within a few meters, all while staying at low altitude, so out of range of Russian radar detection. And then there will be the French hammer bombs, which will further increase the number of bombs used by the Ukrainian Air Force, all while allowing them to strike from farther and farther away while staying at low altitude at a safe distance. So, here I need to explain the objective to you a little bit. Why do they need to stay low? It's because of the radar horizon. The radar can't detect behind hills, so radars only see a relatively short distance when something is flying very, very low. High up, you can detect things hundreds of kilometers away, but being low is problematic. So, the only way to have a radar that can see downward is for it to be an airborne radar. For example, the Russians have the A-50 plane and the Beriev A-50. The problem is that in 2021, they had 9 operational, and today, since the Ukrainians have shot down several, there are only 3 or 4 operational planes left at most. For a huge country like Russia, to give you an idea, France alone has 4 AWACS just for its own territory, and in Europe as a whole there are 28 in total, and Russia would probably need at least as many, if not a lot more, to be able to protect its territory, which is huge, while also covering the entire border with Ukraine, to spot missiles coming in at low altitude or drones flying very, very low, and to track the takeoff of Ukrainian planes and Ukrainian helicopters that might be in flight. So obviously that requires a lot more planes than the 3 they currently have available, especially since they can't replace them. The next system was called the A100, but since they couldn't get the spare parts, which were completely imported, they completely stopped this replacement project. So they're still using the A50 So. However, what also needs to be clear is that the Russians, after being confronted so many times with the defense systems and missile systems sent by the Ukrainians, well, they're going to learn, and just like they trained to detect the Bayraktar TB2, they're going to train on the missiles, for example, the HIMARS missiles. At first, almost all the missiles got through and hit their targets, but by the end of 2022, only 70% were still hitting their targets. In 2023, and especially in 2024, the rates would have dropped to only 30% of hits in the areas that are protected, and in 2025, we're only at 10%. And obviously, this rate is very, very low. It's also because we're dealing with a ballistic system that goes very high, whereas, on the other hand, missiles that fly at low altitude. The Neptune missiles, for example, which were used starting in August 2023 in Crimea to destroy an S-400 air defense system, well, since it flies low, it's much more difficult to intercept. And then, of course, we think of the French Scalp missiles and the British Storm Shadow missiles, which have been integrated onto the Sukhoi 24, and they're going to cause real devastation at first. But even today, only 50% of them reach their target and hit their objective, even when used in coordination with complexity, with drones flying alongside to attract targets to serve as decoys. So at first, 100% efficiency, but today only 50% efficiency when they're used in a very, very complex way. So obviously the Russians are making progress, they're improving, and they no longer have the same level they had at the beginning of the war. And so the systems we provided to the Ukrainians today are no longer as effective. And we can make the same observation with all the systems that have been integrated by Ukraine. For example, when the ATACMS arrive in Ukraine in October 2023, it's a guaranteed direct hit. And we've seen a lot of successful destruction on bases where there were helicopters that were destroyed in large numbers, for example. But now the Ukrainians are telling us that it takes up to 10 ATACMS to destroy a single Russian air defense system, whereas at the beginning it was really a direct hit almost every time. But the other problem for the Russians is that gradually they will also suffer attrition and they will lose a lot of equipment, proven destroyed via open-source images. And we can prove the loss of 368 air defense missile launcher systems, such as the S-300 as well as 112 radars. Some of them were not only destroyed but also captured by the Ukrainians, who were able to reverse engineer them to learn how to avoid them better. There are also 28 anti-aircraft guns like the Tunguska, and another 92 electronic warfare devices, which had the ability to reduce GPS accuracy and thus prevent direct hits. We're only discussing losses confirmed by geolocated images. There are specialized maps, and I'll share links for you to check each time. But the other problem for Russia is that even if its air defense can become more and more effective, there are fewer and fewer areas that are actually protected. They're going to focus on areas where they want to keep the most valuable ammunition, aircraft, and other stockpiles. And there are more and more areas where it's an open season and the Ukrainians can fire more easily. And so in some areas, there's 8% effectiveness for the AMRS, while in other unprotected areas, it's almost a 100% direct hit. So the other problem is that the Russians are also using a lot of missiles to defend themselves, because for 3 years now, Ukraine has been producing more and more long-range drones, like the FP1, which is the most well-known and is now being produced at more than 200 units per day, with a relatively significant effectiveness, since only 30% of these Ukrainian long-range drones actually reach their target. But only 10% of the missiles actually manage to cause the expected damage. And in addition to all these missiles, the Ukrainians are producing an industrial quantity of decoys. For example, I had shown you the Chaika, which costs only 500 euros to travel 700 kilometers and is covered with aluminum. It sends back such a big echo that the Russians shoot at it and exhaust their air defenses, especially by firing S-300 missiles to try to shoot them down, even though these are just small targets, and so in most cases, Russian interceptions are carried out with short-range air defense missiles, which cost a fortune, and with production that obviously can't keep up with consumption, and therefore with Ukrainian production, especially since the sanctions prevent Russia from getting spare parts or the machinery and tools they need to ramp up production. So let's be clear. Without the sanctions, Russia would be producing a lot more missiles to attack Ukraine. They would be producing a lot more missiles for their air defense, and they would have the ability to restart large-scale production of these radars, for which they lack power electronics. And then, as I told you, those radar planes that are essential for being able to detect what is flying just above the ground. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, on their side, now have 2 AWACS radar planes that were provided by Sweden. And so the Ukrainian advantage in the field of air defense is already very clear, because they have unrestricted access to the components they might need to produce their system, but also because the Russians haven't developed low-cost interceptors, like the Ukrainian Sting, which costs only 2,000 euros and which will collide with Shaheds, and they produce them in hundreds of units every day. The Russians also haven't developed this dense network of pickups equipped with simple machine guns, but which shoot down missiles every day for an absolutely negligible cost, while in the air, Ukrainian planes shoot down missiles with their cannons, as you can see here with an F-16, or even with basic laser-guided rockets supplied by companies like Thales in Belgium. I'll soon report from their facility. When Europe, Poland had been flown over by small Russian Gerbera drones costing just a few thousand euros, we used missiles costing over €1 million to try to intercept them. So, obviously, we had to defend ourselves, but this disproportion we faced intercepting those lousy Russian drones, well, the Russians are doing the same thing, by using missiles that are very, very expensive to hit decoys, or for missiles that cost almost nothing. Because the Russians, they still mainly use their Panzers, and they don't have an alternative, since they only started developing these small, low-cost alternatives after they began to be massively attacked, faced with waves of Ukrainian missiles starting in 2024, and when it comes to detection, it's the same thing. The Ukrainians have deployed networks with thousands and thousands of acoustic sensors that make it possible to recognize the missile flying over us and to determine its trajectory. Is it a drone, a missile, etc.? While the Russians rely on radars that are rare, expensive, and can be detected, since a radar emits waves, and so they can be destroyed from a distance. So overall, whether it's for detection, interception, or long-range strikes, today the Ukrainians have an advantage, even though, of course, they have fewer resources. This will help compensate and maintain interception rates. Shahd drones are intercepted at over 90%, cruise missiles at over 70%. And unfortunately, ballistic missiles only at 10%. It's not about technical inefficiency. Ukrainians have shown they can intercept everything with the systems we've given them. The Mamba SAMP-T systems and the American Patriot systems have proven that they are capable of intercepting hypersonic missiles. Simply put, they haven't been provided with the necessary quantity. Only a few cities are protected, and so, for the most part, the Russians are going to strike cities that aren't protected. Just like I mentioned earlier about the HIMARS that the Ukrainians use where there is no air defense and no jamming system, well, the Russians are going to use their ballistic missiles, either in a salvo or on cities where there is no capability to intercept them. And anyway, there's another advantage for Ukraine, which is obviously the size of the country. Russia is simply too gigantic to be properly protected, even if they had the best air defense systems in the world. You can actually see on this map the successful strikes, the proven Ukrainian successes in 2025, thanks to satellite images or images shared by the Russians themselves. I'll also provide links to watch all these videos. So there are 3 main conclusions to all this. First, today, Russian air defense is certainly no longer the poor air defense it was in February 2022. They have learned a lot, they've improved a lot. And if we had to face this air defense today, well, we should expect that a significant portion of our missiles won't reach their targets, or may even be completely outmatched. That's the case, for example, with the ATACMS and the HIMARS, which are reaching the end of their service life anyway and were supposed to be replaced by their successors. But it also means that all our drones, whether they're the size of the Bayraktar or larger, like the Patroller in France, for example, are unable to approach the front within 40 kilometers if they don't want to be shot down. And so we also need to prepare to have an industrial base that's capable of producing hundreds and hundreds of low-cost systems per day, both for long-range strikes, for air defense interception, and also to have sensors that will be effective and low-cost. And today we still haven't switched to this low-cost efficiency model. We're still using systems that are incredibly sophisticated but cost a fortune, and we can only produce a few units per day maybe, while the opposing vectors will be coming in by the hundreds every day. So logically there's a disproportion. That's why we should also welcome the announcements, like the one from Renault, which will provide mass industrialization expertise to produce long-range missiles that will first serve Ukraine, But then we'll have this industrial tool for France. For example, Altares is the only French company producing systems like the Sting, which actually intercepted Shahed drones in Ukraine, which actually succeeded in its interception test in France under very strict conditions set by the Armament Directorate at the Biscarrosse Testing Center, so we have a French gem. We still haven't decided to buy them to offer to Ukraine, contrary to what we had promised. But in any case, today we need to press the button to save the Ukrainians and to be ready tomorrow to be able to defend ourselves if, unfortunately, we ever need to. The second conclusion obviously concerns the Ukrainians. As I said, there is an interception rate that is interesting, that is very good, that is very, very high. But simply, they won't be able to go any further because of us. Our ability to ramp up the production of heavy air defense systems like Aster 30, Aster 15 Patriot missiles, simply we don't provide enough. And so they would need to develop local air defense capabilities. I saw a few weeks ago, you saw it too, the company Firepoint, which now has a program to produce a national air defense system. I hope they succeed, because obviously they can't rely on us. And in any case, let's be honest, the Russians aren't targeting military targets, they're targeting civilian ones. And so today we haven't been up to the task of defending them. So the Ukrainians will take over and will also make up for our shortcomings. It will have taken a few years to develop them. And in principle, the Ukrainian air defense systems will begin to enter operational service in 2026. And then the last conclusion concerns Russia. And even if they manage today to develop low-cost interceptors to intercept more long-range drones, they are certainly simply stuck when it comes to intercepting real missiles, because they cannot increase their production of real interceptor missiles. Additionally, over 5 new long-range missiles will enter service with the Ukrainian army this year, with both ballistic missiles like the FP-7 and FP-9 and also cruise missiles with stealth coatings for the first time. And I hope we will hear about them very soon. Also, remember the increased production of missiles like the Flamingo and Neptune, which we already know about. Or, of course, the foreign aid that will arrive, which will continue to increase. And so, it's sad, but that's the reality on the ground. Both protagonists will continue to destroy each other and undermine their ability to have a viable economic future. It's destruction, it's attrition. Since it is unable to win the war militarily, Russia is trying to break the civilians behind the lines. That's why long-range warfare is so important, and regardless of local temporary successes, however marginal, on the front line. In reality, it's about who will collapse first, who will get tired first, and both sides are hitting each other, with exhaustion on both sides. To be clear, I've discussed the Russian economy several times, but the Ukrainian economy is also struggling now, mainly due to electricity shortages. It's not fair. That's not how war should be fought. But we haven't given Ukrainians the means to defend themselves properly. Let me remind you about the Sky Shield operation, which we're supporting to intercept missiles when they're in range, or that we could cross the border to protect cities, or why our nuclear power plants, which are now regularly targeted by the Russians, not being protected. And also, don't forget that you can participate. Part of the aid you've provided, for example, with Team Berlioz, has helped buy infrared cameras that allow us to see the Shahed drones coming. It's much more effective than the searchlights scanning the sky. And some of the drones also allow us to see the missiles coming with better advance warning. This allows for a better interception rate. Because, for example, if you have a missile coming in, you have to launch. You must cool the seeker head of the shoulder-fired man-pads, but when missiles come in very low, there isn't enough time to activate and fire it.